Hi, I'm Charles Galda, President of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action radio program and podcast. We talked with New England leaders about making disciples, doing justice, and sharing Jesus to accelerate evangelism. Because we know when the people of God do the work of God, it transforms lives, our communities, and the world. Today, I've got a special guest with us, Kyler Barr, Pastor Kyler Barr, one of my former pastors when we lived in Connecticut. Kyler is the former pastor of NextGen ministry at Walnut Hill Community Church in Connecticut. But he also is working across New England, coaching, training, and working with senior pastors, NextGen pastors, other leaders to help them reach people with the gospel, reach young people with the gospel. Kyler, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Kyler, the topic of making disciples has been getting a lot of renewed focus from church leaders we work with around New England. And there's a sense of what worked in the past isn't sufficient for today. And maybe that some of what we did in the past wasn't working the way we thought it was as well. There's conversation about biblical illiteracy, not seeing transformed lives as a result of discipleship, missing manifestations of the fruits of the Spirit, young people leaving the church, and of course, the rise of the nuns. And I know that kind of falls way in your sweet spot. And so I want to pursue that, but I want to define a couple of terms for folks, if you would, to start. When we say the word next gen, what technically not a word, but when we say the word next gen, what do we mean?
Yeah, so it's used for a lot of different groups within the church, and really is trying to capture some sort of younger group that we're wanting to support and help out. I usually, when I'm talking about next gen, I'm talking about adolescents and emerging adults. So people in middle school, high school, college, and just out of college as they work together. And so that's kind of my sweet spot that I'm working with. Though some people will include children in that, and some people will say they're next gen and they're 45. So
and the next gen, right?
That's right. That's right.
And so, okay, so we're talking about, call them, middle school to early 20s, young adult age range, which is a pretty broad span in terms of where folks are today. But let me ask you, let's shift for a second, and I want to come back to that, to, well, what is a disciple? If we're going to talk about disciple making, what is a disciple?
Yeah. I think as we talk about this, about what a disciple is, it's a follower, someone who follows Jesus. And so when we talk about discipling, I think of when Gordon MacDonald told us that it was someone helping people hear God's call on their lives and answer it, right? And so helping people to see God at work in their specific context, the place where he's put them, and know how to step into the role he has for them there. It's a lot like Dallas Willard was asked a question in an interview years ago about how we can grow as Christians and what it looks like to grow as Christians. And he said, you need to do the next right thing that you know you ought to do. And so helping to disciple someone is helping them figure out what that next right thing is, what it is, what's the next faithful step they can take, and helping them know how to take it. And so a disciple is someone who's in that process of taking that next right step over and over and over again to follow Jesus.
And so that does sound to me focused around maybe call and mission.
Mm-hmm.
And well, go ahead, respond. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say it's call and mission, but it's not necessarily always vocational call and mission. It includes vocational call and mission, but a lot of the questions that we're getting from people as young adults and adolescents are asking for even now mentorship and help figuring out how to live faithfully is more about how I do this now in the context I'm in, how I live out God's call in this moment. And so it's also that general, what does it look like to live as a follower of Jesus today?
So that starts to get into the topic of the way I phrase it sometimes is, do we look different than the world?
Sure.
Right. And so are we living differently? Is that what you're getting at there?
It is. It's about life change. And not only do we look different, but how do we look different and why do we look different?
And so, which of course plays into me answering the call and knowing, right, to your point about what Dallas Willard and Gordon were saying. And so but the starting point, it sounds like it would be this phase of, I need to be different to live different. And so how do you go ahead. How do you do that? How do you think about that with specifically with next gen people?
Well,
Because it's too late for guys like me.
first of all, it's not too late for guys like you, Charles. I'm pretty sure you're at the top end of this next gen that we're
That's
talking
right.
about. But as I look at next gen, one of the things that's exciting to me is that whether it's middle school through that early young adulthood, that early 20s, it's a time in life when you're really facing some of these questions about who you are and who God's created you to be, and how you're going to engage in the world. So it's really that period where you're doing this identity exploration and figuring out who has God designed me to be, and how does that matter in the bigger picture? How can I be a part of something bigger than myself? And so it's exciting to me because it's the questions that people are already asking. It's just helping them figure out a faithful lens through which to process those things. And so you're just providing that lens and being one of the voices that can be a part of that.
And it's interesting to me. I hadn't really thought of it before when you're working with that next gen group, because psychologists and folks like that will tell us that by the time I think you hit 25,
Yep.
is things are set.
Yep.
And that after that, we don't really change absent kind of a life-changing or traumatic event in our lives. And so you're working with them when they're trying to lock in who they're going to be in their lives.
Yeah, and it's changes after that are take a lot more work, and they go a lot more slowly. Anyone who's trying to follow a New Year's resolution right now is probably figuring that out.
Yeah, you're being generous. I always say, look, people don't like to change. New Englanders really don't like to change, and New England Christians for sure. We're not changing. And so how do you then do that? What is there a process you look like if you think about any one of those age groups? Is there a process you bring them through, or as a program or training or equipping, or because there's a change of heart that underlies all of this?
Yeah.
But but how do you influence the change of heart? And
so I think the answer to that, first of all, is that there are lots of processes that you can take people through. There's a lot of good content out there if you're just looking to engage people in figuring out what some possible next right steps are. And so there's been a lot of work that's been done on kind of some of these linear discipleship models. And we don't need to throw out all of that work, but we may need to recognize that that's not exactly how discipleship works, certainly not for this next generation. They're kind of trying to think of how we can apply these models to this situation and another situation and this thing that I'm facing. And so it's really about coming alongside people as they walk through life. Mentorship, I mentioned, is something that young adults in particular are asking for, though I hear teens asking for this as well. And I think people are recognizing that they're not really sure how to walk through life in a way where the things that they're talking with friends about in their small groups, or that they're talking about on Sunday, really impact Tuesday and Thursday as they walk through life. And so one of the things they're asking for is for help, for mentorship doing that, and then on the other side, for a community to do it with. And as they go there, I think a lot of times when we think particularly of mentorship, for my generation, I'm 42. And so for my generation, a lot of times mentorship meant you're apprenticing under someone. You find someone you want to be more like, and you spend a lot of time with them, figuring out what they do in their context, so that you can then learn what to do to emulate that. And there's still value in that, but I don't think that's what most people are asking for when the next generation is asking for mentorship. They're asking for people to come alongside them as they process things in their context. And so it's really more about coming and saying, hey, look what God's doing over here, or what might God be asking you to do in this spot. And just having real conversations where you're talking about life. And so I think there's a real relational component to what it looks like to disciple in this context, that defies the linear program, but certainly uses the work that's been putting into building them.
Is mentoring really the need, or have we conditioned a generation of people to ask for mentors? Right. I think about it in the corporate world where I came from, and we're always telling people, you need to find a mentor, you need to find a mentor. And guess what? They're all sitting there going, I need a mentor. I need a, right. Is it we've conditioned people to do that, and they really don't know what they're asking for? Or is there a real need here that that really can be productive in your experience?
Yeah, no, I think there's a real need if we're willing to broaden our picture of what mentoring can look like. And so you're wondering if they're asking for mentoring the way we think of it. I'm not sure that that matters. They're asking for help. And so if we can figure out ways to provide that help, then we're really going to be able to be one of the voices that can speak truth into their lives, that can help them process things. And so I think that's huge. One of the things that we think of that mentors can fill a role for is really helping people have a lens to view things through and put it into real time and practice it. I say often to people that this generation is not starving for a lack of information. They're drowning in all the information that they have. And so I think the apprenticeship model was just trying to get information to them. And there still is a time to make sure that we're giving good information so that they can see that. But if I just give information, that information lasts as long as I'm the authority. And there are so many other authorities that are out there. If I can help students and emerging adults develop a process for really faithfully walking through the information that's available to them and figuring out how it's going to matter in their lives, that can make a difference.
Yeah, there's the aspect of them swimming in information, but what you're reminding me of is I listened to a podcast, the National Association of Evangelicals had it on a little while back about this concept of the repeating patterns of generations that goes back hundreds of years. And for my generation, I'm a little bit older than you. For my generation, that information was a really big deal because we care about what's true, right? And so give us the information, let us sift through it, let us figure out what's true, and that's where we go to. Their story, and I'd love your view on it. Their view was that young people today are not asking the question of what is true. Would you agree with that? And if so, what question are they asking?
Yeah, I would agree that they're maybe asking it differently. I think truth still matters, but they want to see embodied truth. They want to see what it looks like to live truthfully. They want to see what it looks like to live honestly to what they believe and to what they know to be true. And so in that way, I think it's important for them to see adults wrestling through the same things. I think of youth group where I've had leaders come up to me after a talk or at an event that we're in, and they'll say, "Man, I think I'm learning more than the students are from this." And I'll say, "Great," because that's what they need. They don't just need to hear information. Look, I'm a youth pastor. I've given a lot of youth talks. I had a fantastic youth pastor, Van Marceau. When I was growing up, I was in his group from 7th through 12th grade, and I don't remember any of his messages, right? Like I remember pieces of them, pieces of what he said. I remember the lessons he taught, but I don't remember the actual messages that he gave. But I do remember walking through those concepts with the leaders and seeing it impact the lives of my small group leader and the people that were connected with me. And so seeing leaders actually wrestle with things and seeing things change in their lives is powerful. And it's also powerful to have those same leaders point out where this information, where this truth is impacting the life of the students, and asking questions so that they can figure out what that looks like in the student's context and how to apply that well.
And I think the reality is and I'm with you, right? Remember the message. I don't remember things that way, right? We're like 10 minutes after church, I don't remember what the sermon was. But years later, when you say, well, why do you believe what you believe? I can bring it back to, right? And I've done that with when I've journaled, where it's like, oh, I don't remember this at all, but I got this from Kyler, right? And I believe this because of what he said. And so there's an aspect of this that sounds like it includes the kind of traditional things we might have done to convey the truths of our faith. But it sounds like, and that probably would have been enough for my generation, but it sounds like the question they're asking is a little bit beyond that of what is real. Because they see my hypocrisy of I believe things, because we're all hypocrites, right? I believe things that I don't quite live out all the time. And young people are seeing that, and that's just maybe more discrediting generationally. And so there's a piece of it that's okay, those truths, but then what is this apprenticing, mentoring, whatever you want to call it? What does this look like that gets from that truth to the change, the impact in their life and change in their life, and the reality, or I think they use the word authenticity, I hear a lot.
Sure.
And I think there's a whole lot of issues around that, but we won't get into that today. But what does that look like? What does that process look like? Or what does the relationship look like? Besides, what I hear is a lot of time, which I think is a challenge for most people.
Well, it is a lot of time, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a lot of time for each person that's engaged in the student's life or in the young adult's life. I think that's one of the things that needs to change about the way we think about discipleship. Is so often we think, well, there's someone who's discipling, and they're going to disciple someone, and they'll start at the beginning and they'll walk them through the end. But if we're honest about it, that's not the process that's worked in our lives. We've certainly had people who've walked with us longer than other people, or in more intentional ways. But it's really been a lot of different people that have had an impact here in this season, an impact there in this other season, that God has used to help form us into who He wants us to be for the context that He's placed us in.
So here's what I struggle with, and I always assume my problem is everybody's problem, right? Just like when you're the Sunday school teacher, you're really dealing with my issues, right? And so I agree. Great Commission says I have an obligation to make disciples.
Yep.
I agree. I hear from folks like you, experts in the field, that young people want older people in their lives, mentoring, apprenticing, whatever term we want to put to it. And there's a clear need. And as we get older, we actually have more time than we realize if we're willing to prioritize things. Maybe when we're, with families and school and work, right? At some point that shifts. And so I'm at that stage now where I could spend time with someone. Sure. I don't know what to do with them.
Okay.
So let's say I'm in my church and there's somebody in that next gen range. I don't think I should walk up to them and say, I'm going to mentor you.
I think that is what you should do. It'll be really effective, Charles.
Come do what I tell you.
That's right.
And so there's a piece of making the connection, but there's another piece for me of struggle. Okay, but I don't know when we sit down Monday morning, I don't know what to do with you.
Yeah. Well, I'll speak to the making the connection piece first. Number one, I would say that we need to be thinking more broadly about the relationships that students are in. What I mean by that is that maybe students are involved with some sort of youth leader or Sunday school teacher or group of friends, parent in their life who does care about them and is trying to engage them. Maybe connecting with the people that you see already engaging with students and saying, hey, are there students that I could maybe be helpful with? Is there something I could do to start to build relationship with students? It doesn't take that long for students to trust you if they know that you genuinely care about them. And so finding time to actually demonstrate that care somehow is important. And so as you're walking through this, I would lean on the resources of people who are already connected to students. But the other thing I would do is look around. One of the things I love about this idea of going and making disciples is that there's an intentionality to it. There's a prayerful, thoughtful action that needs to be taken. And I would suggest that people start by looking around and praying and asking God, where are the people in my life who I'm already connected to, who I could maybe be more intentional with? Some of this happens in official church structures, but I have a good friend who has worked as a youth leader, but some of his most effective discipleship has happened in people he employs at his small business that he connects with day in and day out, over and over and over again. And so I think one of the big things is starting to be more intentional about the relationships that you already have. And then using some of the relationships you may have with people who are connected to students to then find ways to connect to students if you haven't already.
And this may not work at the younger age, but really, when you get into your college students into your early 20s, it's a simple thing to just say, hey, you want to have lunch after church on Sunday? right? And I remember being in that age group, and if you were going to feed me, I'd have gone
Yep.
anywhere you wanted, right?
Well, and I think there are opportunities like that that are missed, right? And some of it's just fear of rejection or whatever the case may be. But I think of the churches in our area connecting to college students. One of the things that college students long for is something that's a little bit more of a normal home situation. They
Mm,
are often together in this college bubble, which is fantastic, but it's not complete. And so, as students come from the university and engage in our churches, many of them are open to coming and having lunch or doing something like that. Now, I would suggest maybe inviting 2 or 3 students
yeah,
to come over for lunch instead of one. It can feel a bit like an inquisition
yeah, yeah.
if you just invite one over and have them sit at the table with you and grill them with questions. But as you have 2 or 3 college students come over for lunch and to hang out, I think that's a powerful way of seeing kind of what develops. I do think we're also looking at some ways to create those connections that are answering other questions that college students have, that emerging adults have, that even our high schoolers have. There are some real questions about what the future looks like, about what it looks like to engage their faith in work. And so one of the things that we did during my time at Walnut Hill was we started these young professionals gatherings. And so they were an opportunity for us to take some young professionals who were asking questions about how they could best walk through their work world, and connect them with people who were leaders in the work field,
Mm,
and kind of have a lunch together and talk about faith and work and how those intersect. And it just created an opportunity for relationships. So if you're here with a church, listening with a church, and are looking for ways to create those relationships, I would say to build something that meets a need that the students or emerging adults in your area have, and then just start it and have some of the adults come, and relationships will be built. You'll see it around the table, and it makes it much easier for that adult to ask them to coffee afterwards.
yeah, there is this fine tension between I want to do something,
Yeah,
right? To because I feel that call to make disciples. I want to do something, but I also can't make you feel like my project,
right.
right?
Yeah, and I
Any
think
guidance?
that's a huge tension, because especially because, as we were talking about, this linear nature of maybe the couple generations before, and our to-do lists and the things we want to check off, nobody wants to feel like there's something being checked off.
Yeah.
And so I guess my biggest piece of guidance in that is to step back from this whole process of discipleship and realize that there's no way that you are going to step in and be able to check the box of having made a disciple.
Mhm.
That's just not a realistic picture. It takes more people. God is the one who is ultimately the one who's in authority and at work. It's His agency that we rely on for disciple making. And your job isn't to take someone from 0 to 100 in disciple making. Your job is to play the role that God has for you, in the people that He's placed you in relationship with, and to be intentional about it and vulnerable with it, and to be real about what it looks like to follow Jesus. But you're helping people not learn to be exactly who you were and emulate you, but to learn from what it looked like for you to follow Jesus and apply it to their context, so they can figure out a little bit more of what it means for them to follow Jesus.
Well, some of what I've noticed in our work at Vision New England, and I assume the same thing is true here, is you get a lot of mileage if I enter into your world as
Sure.
opposed to invite. So going to your school play, going to your sports event, going to your right, doing the things, going into your world, disadvantages myself a little bit, but I think that's what the gospel is all about, right?
It is.
But it builds that relationship, and at some point, then I think I get to speak into your life the way you were talking about, where so many people did that with us because we had a relationship with them in our own life, and my wife and my life, who were older than us.
Yeah.
We were just always real multi-generational. And there were things where, you're washing pots over after the church dinner and you're having a
Yep.
conversation that ends up being pretty impactful, but it wasn't going to happen because I said, let's meet Mondays at 8.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things that is a real challenge in discipleship for this generation, is knowing how we go into your world, right? It's gotten harder to just attend events and things that exist at the schools or in the community. It's gotten harder to find places where students gather because that's not as much of a thing anymore. And so not only people within the church, but the youth leaders within the church are asking these questions. The young adult pastors within the church are asking these questions. Where is their world? How do we connect and how do we hang out? And that's one of the things that I think helped with this young professionals gathering, is that it took a segment of that group and it said, hey, here's their world. Let's create a space to kind of gather and speak into it. But you don't have to create a space for that to happen. I think a lot of what you're looking at doing is saying, hey, as I come toward your world, where are places that your world and my world intersect? Where do they cross over? And it's taking advantage of those spaces. One of the things that I think is powerful that God uses is when people serve alongside each other. And so I love seeing intergenerational service opportunities within churches where different generations are serving beside each other, whether that's helping with a food distribution or helping in tech or helping to lead classes. There are these opportunities to kind of work shoulder to shoulder, and you have some discussions and opportunities that you may never have otherwise. And those opportunities can really spark something that can become discipleship moments that really matter.
And so, Kyler, if folks are listening and saying, boy, Kyler really knows what he's talking about, which I expect a lot of folks are, how can they reach out to you if they want to probe this further or engage with you?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I don't know what I'm talking about. I just know that we don't know what we're talking about. And so I'm asking some of the right questions. And before I give my information, I'll just say that's a huge part of being willing to work with the next generation, is admitting that we don't have it all figured out, that we don't have it perfectly, because they'll figure that out, and being willing to ask questions that kind of really understand what they're walking through. We make a lot of assumptions about what's being walked through that just may not be entirely the truth of what they're doing and what they're going through and where they're trying to apply their faith. And so asking questions to clarify that are huge, especially when they come with a big issue or a big question. Make sure you're answering what they're asking. And so ask some clarifying questions. And then I think it gives us a chance to be one of the voices that God uses to speak truth into their lives. I think of a student, Declan, who was really involved in discipleship in a way that I saw it work this way at Walnut Hill. He had not one person that he was following along, but a variety of people, whether it was pastors, friends of his parents, of course, his own friends that were in a crew with him, all these different people that have spoken into his life at different points as he's growing up. And he's been able to take things that he's walked through and use them now to speak it in a camp setting that he was attending and in his own youth group, and start to see how he can be used to help other people grow and disciple people. And so helping people understand how this can really be a more, organic's an overused word, but a more natural process that they're walking through, I think is huge. And so I love being in conversations like that all across New England. There are Gen Z summits that are happening. We've got churches that we're trying to walk through things. We've got all these different conversations that we're trying to bring together so we can say, how can we help connect this generation to the church? And if you're trying to connect with me about that, probably the easiest way is my email. And it's I have a unique name, so I get an easy email. It's kylerbarr@gmail.com. And you can just reach out to me there.
And that's Barr with 2 R's.
Yes, KYLERBARR.
And if you have any trouble, just go to visionnewengland.org. You can email me and we'll get you hooked up with Kyler. Kyler, thanks so much for being with us. And thank you for your ministry in a really critical area for the church and for people. And so thanks again. I'd like to thank Jessica Mangano, our producer. And you can find out more at visionnewengland.org, where we have past episodes, other resources, and you can donate to help accelerate evangelism in New England. I'd like to thank our audience for being with us and for their faithfulness in answering God's call to make disciples who do justice and share Jesus to transform New England.
And Charles, hold on. I'd like to thank you for being one of the people asking these questions across our region. They're very important questions, and it's great to get a chance to be here and talk about it today.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And one last note, this program is sponsored by the Luis Palau Association, who's dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide. Thanks again for being with us.